When analyzing the performance of a cache or the performance of a memory hierarchy, an interesting measure is to measure the average memory access time. The average memory access time will be the average time to complete a memory access for all accesses that a program does. So in the general definition, we to include all accesses, all access to instructions, all access for data, and that will give me the performance of the memory system itself, independent of the processors. So let's talk about the average memory access time. The heat time is also important for performance because the heat time is the time that it takes for me to provide data or instruction when I have a heat, and I expect to have heat most of the time in a well-designed memory hierarchy. The average memory access time will be the heat time plus the miss rate times the miss penalty. So let's do an example. I want to find the average memory access time for a processor with a 1 nanosecond clock cycle time, a miss penalty of 20 clock cycles, and a miss rate of 0.05 misses per access. And I have a cache access time, including the heat detection, of 1 clock cycle. So I can figure out whether the data is in the cache, and I can access the data, and I can complete all that in 1 clock cycle. And I will assume that the read and the write miss penalty are the same, and I will ignore any other write stalls. So I have the processor, I have the cache, and then I will have the memory. Let me just move this here, then I can get to the memory. So I have the processor, the cache, and the memory, and I have that the processor, and again, I can just take a number, and I'll take 1000, just like 1000. So let's say that the processor has 1000 accesses. This is not a split cache. This is a unified cache because this example doesn't tell me anything about split caches. So is that I have a miss rate of 0.05 misses per access. So it means that of the 1000 requests that I get, 50 of them will go to the memory. Tells me that the cache access time is 1 cycle, including the heat detection, and that the memory has an access miss penalty of 20 cycles. So every time that I go to the memory, I pay 20 cycles, and I can compute the average memory access time as the number of accesses times 1 cycle, because it takes 1 cycle to access the cache, plus the number of misses, which it would be 50, times 20 cycles, which is the miss penalty, and I divide that by the total number of accesses, and I have an average memory access time of 2 nanoseconds, because I said that the processor operates at a 1 nanosecond clock cycle time. Now let's look at another example. In this case, I want to find the average memory access time for a program where 20% of the instructions are loads and stores, and the processor runs at a 1 nanosecond clock cycle time. It has a miss penalty of 100 clock cycles. It has an iCache miss rate of 0.03 misses per instruction, and has a decache miss of 0.1 misses per access. The access time, including the heat detection for both the iCache and the decache, is 1 clock cycle. So I have the processor, I have the memory, and in this case I have an iCache and I have a decache. And my average memory access time will be the number of clock cycles divided by the number of accesses. And it says that the access time is one cycle for the iCache and 1 cycle for the decache. It says that the miss penalty is 100 clock cycles, so accessing memory costs me 100 cycles. And again, I can assume that I have 1000 instruction fetches. If I have 1000 instruction fetches, 20% of the instructions are loaded or stored, so there will be 200 accesses to the decache, because only loads and store instructions access the decache. The access to those are in parallel, because remember that I can access the D cache in the memory stage of an instruction while fetching another instruction from the I cache. So what I have is that I have 1,200 accesses. I have 1,000 times 1 cycle instruction fetch access. Note that it's not 1,200 times 1 cycle, because the 200 accesses to the D cache happens in parallel with the 1,000 accesses to the instruction cache. And now my I cache has a miss rate of 3%, so that will be 30 requests to the memory from the I cache. And my D cache has a miss rate of 10%, so that will be 20 requests from the D cache. So I have a total of 50 requests to the memory, and those are sequential accesses. They are not in parallel. If the I cache and the D cache miss at the same time, we're going to have to wait for the 100 cycles, for example, for the instruction, and then another 100 cycles for the data. So those accesses are sequential, so I need to count for both of them. So the total is 50 requests. So I have 50 times 100 cycles, and if I do the math correctly, that will be 5 cycles per access, or I could say that is 5 nanoseconds, because I have 1 nanoseconds per cycle. Okay? So now we'll change the problem and say what we're going to do is introduce a second level of cache. So what is the new average memory access time if an L2 cache now is added to this memory hierarchy? So this L2 cache has an access time of 20 cycles, and the local miss rate of this I2 cache is 20%. So an access to the memory is only started after the access to the L2 cache miss or hit is completed. That is also important in the problem. I'm going to have to tell you that, because I could do it one way or the other. So here's my L2 cache, and I have 30 access from the I cache, and I have the 20 accesses from the D cache, but now they do not go straight to memory. They go into the L2 cache. And the access time in the L2 cache is 20 cycles, but I'm not going to start the access to the memory until I have spent those 20 cycles in the L2 cache. And that is an important information to have. And then the local miss rate of the L2 cache is 20%, which means that I apply this 20% only to the requests that come to the L2 cache. So I have 50 requests that come to the L2 cache. 10 of them have to proceed to the main memory. So what I have is that for this 50 requests, I pay a 20 cycles penalty, 50 times 20. And for this 10 access to the memory, I pay 100 cycles penalty. You can see that it's much easier to create your equations here by drawing this diagram in this way, because it's much more visual to see what the problem is saying. So if I do the math correctly, now I have a 2.5 cycles per access instead of the 5 cycles per access that I had before. So I reduced my average memory access time by half by inserting a new level of cache on L2 cache. And now you understand the motivation for using multiple levels of cache, because as I go down in the hierarchy, the access time gets higher, but the capacity of the cache also gets larger. And I can, instead of sending every access that misses in the L1 cache to the memory, I can catch some of them at a higher level of caches and have reduced the penalty for the L1 cache. And the question now is, how much faster is the machine with the L2 cache in comparison with the machine without the L2 cache? So the math with no L2 was 5 nanoseconds. The math with L2 was 2.5 nanoseconds. So given that the basic CPI with the ideal caches is the same, and the number of accesses is the same, we can simply divide the two maths, because we are talking about the same machine, and the design with L2 is 2 times faster than the design with without L2. And this is a note now in local versus global hit rate. The problem said that the local hit rate of L2 was 20%. So the local hit rate of any level of cache is the number of access that get to that level. So the number of access that get here divided divided by the number of access that the local hit rate is the number of access that are found in here divided by the total number of access that arrive there. So if I would just consider the number of access that are found here versus the total number of access for the whole machine, that rate would be the global rate. So this is the 40 divided by 50, this is an 80% hit rate for the L2. If I want the global hit rate of L2, I would have to compare the number of access that get to L2, that are found in L2, divided by the total number of access. In this case, it will be 40 that get there, and there is a total number of access of 1,200 for this program, so this is 6.7%. So we need to understand when we get hit rate or a miss rate for a given level of cache, whether we are talking about the local or the global one. So summary of performance, when the CPU performance increases, the miss penalty becomes more significant because the faster the processor is, if the memory is not faster, the memory will weigh down the execution of the program because it will gonna make it slower. The other observation is that if I decrease the base CPI, a greater proportion of the time will be spent in memory stalls. So, which means that better processors with the same memory system are going to spend more time waiting for the memory. If I increase the clock rate, the memory stalls also going to account for more of the CPU cycles. And the bottom line is that I cannot neglect the cache behavior when I'm evaluating a system performance. The memory hierarchy performance is very important for the performance of any computing system.